Hey everyone, welcome to today's webinar. Great to have you with us. Got Shavantha as well, who I will introduce properly. But today's webinar, as we know, financial stripped bare the COVID-19 effect. A little bit about Creditor Watch, Australia's leading and most innovative credit reporting bureau with over 50,000 customers, a huge range of products and product suites and features. It keeps growing almost on a quarterly basis. Today we will be talking about number 6 around financial risk assessment, getting that real in-depth, comprehensive understanding of key trading partners, whether they are suppliers, partners, or debtors. So I'm looking forward to getting stuck into it. We've got a fantastic speaker in Shavantha today. We've got a great topic to go through, very relevant with everything that's going on, reporting season, COVID-19. We've had safe harbour, extended legislation changes, etc., etc. So lots to get through. Before we get started, of course, any questions that you've got, please do ask them in the GoToWebinar control panel. Will you get a copy of today's recording and presentation? Yes, you will. We are recording it. We'll send out slides and a recording at the end of the presentation today. And of course, there's always more webinars, so jump online, creditorwatch.com.au/webinars, I believe it is, but you'll find the links online. So welcome Shavantha, who is our guest speaker extraordinaire today. Thanks for joining us, Shavantha. He is the CEO at CreditSource. He has led credit risk functions for a variety of multinational and ASX listed companies over the years. 20 years of experience, 20 plus years of experience, I should say, and he's a real specialist in risk decisioning, financial analysis, risk strategy, modeling, formulas, the sort of things that certainly aren't my strong point, and that's why we get the experts in to talk to you guys. So let me just touch on really quickly what is financial risk assessment, and then I will pass over to Shavantha to take over. So financial risk assessment, available within the credit reports of Creditor Watch when you're performing a search, provides, as I said, a really in-depth and comprehensive view of the financial health of the company. So it's actually looking at not just the normal information you would get from a Creditor Watch report, Creditor Watch data, whether there's adverse score, etc. It's looking at, importantly, the financials of that company. Whether it is financials because they're a reporting entity and they have to submit their financials on an annual basis. If they're not a reporting entity, we can source, or you can source, the financials from the company that you want that report on. And Shavantha, with his team at CreditSource, will run the numbers and ultimately produce what we call as a financial risk assessment. So gets a fairly in-depth view to understand how they've been tracking for the last 2 years, 3 years, depending on how you want. So there's a number of options in there for you to decide how you want to review them. Obviously, the further back you go in their financials, the better the trends are, or the better view of the trends that Shavantha and his team can utilize when producing the assessment. And just to sort of be clear, CreditSource is a third party, but we have a strategic partnership with them, and they take care of all of the financial risk assessments that are run via Creditor Watch. And if needed, we can do more bespoke offerings of those reports as well, depending on the requirements that you might have within your business. So what I will do now is pass over control to Shavantha, and he can take us through the presentation. It's great to have him on board today, and I'll just pass it over now. There we go.
Fantastic. One slide back, please, if you may.
Yep.
All right. So where I want to start off perhaps is talk a bit about the numbers and the statistics that we hear ever so often today, or in the recent past. We've had numbers thrown across to us, for example, being told that the last quarters, that's the June quarter's GDP contraction at 7% has been the worst since the quarterly records or quarterly GDP records have been ever maintained. That's since 1959. We've been told that the annualized GDP contraction is the worst since World War II. The households are spending less money, and that's understandable, but the numbers in that front is 12% less than what they spent before COVID. And in a recent parliamentary hearing, NZ gave some numbers where they said that their credit card portfolio has shrunk from 7.5 billion to 5 billion or $5.5 billion. So that's a significant reduction, and all cues to the fact that people are spending less money. Now, what we do makes us go through a lot of financials of public and private sector organizations, and not all organizations or not all companies have suffered the same consequences that are depicted by these aggregate economic numbers, and I want to take you through this. So one thing to bear before we start is it's not all doom and gloom. There are clear winners, but there are people who have been significantly affected as well. The second thing I want to do in terms of the method that I'm going to use over here, I'd use a bit of a scrapbook approach, if I may. Instead of putting down our findings into nice little tables, we're just going to take snapshots of the actual financial records that have been published by companies and take those as examples to talk about the trends that we see. And in doing that, we'll look at some observations and examples and then try to see whether we could generalize certain trends. Next slide, please. So let's start with something familiar. I mean, these are obviously not anything that's new. Similar numbers have been thrown out there all the time. So Webjet, for example, if you look at their 19 and 20 performance, you can see that there has been a 27% reduction in revenue. And that's understandable because the travel sector has been very badly hit. Next slide. Another example is the Village Roadshow company, which has theme parks and cinemas. Again, quite obvious. These guys have been affected quite significantly, and their revenues, if you look at it from 19 to 20, has been as less as, come down by about 25%. Next. And retail has been very badly hit as well because of the closure of malls and customers not being able to reach these places. So if you talk about the retail food group, which owns a couple of well-known brands such as, Donut King, Brumbies, and Gloria Jeans, their revenue has been down as much as 25% as well. But here's the thing, you might look at these numbers and say, oh, given the numbers that's coming out from an economic perspective and the fact that, everybody knows that the economy has been devastated with the COVID impact, these reductions in revenue doesn't seem too steep. They look reasonably okay, all things considered. Now, the point is that the true magnitude of the issues that is faced by these companies? Next slide, please. Now, I think the thing that we got to bear in mind over here is that for 7 to 8 months of the financial year, companies were not affected. So most got affected with COVID starting around Feb or March, which means for 7 to 8 months of the financial year, the June financial year, companies were trading without any problems. So the conclusion that we make out of this is that if COVID lasted for or throughout the financial year, the impact seen would have been much worse. So it's important to note when we see reductions in revenue, not to generalize that and think that 2021 is going to be the same. 2021 hopefully is going to be better, but if the COVID-19 outcomes continue, then it can be much worse than what we've seen in 2020. Next slide, please. So here's a really good example. So Center Group is the company that manages the Westfield shopping malls, and I found some interesting insights as to how the COVID-19 issues have impacted companies on a more quarterly basis. So if you look at the column on the right-hand side, you will see that's the 12 months to Jan 2020. And if you look at the next one, you will see that's the more recent numbers. The change over there is the annual numbers are down 4.9%, but the six months numbers, if you look at the performance, it's down by 12%, so more than double the annualized numbers. So what this shows us is that while the annualized numbers can be a little less scary, if you look at the more recent numbers, those numbers can be really bad. Now, hopefully, we get out of the COVID situation sooner rather than later and things get back to normal. But this has to be kept in mind when we're analyzing financials, because if these conditions continue, then next year's trading performance is going to be much worse. Next slide, please.
It's fair to say that most likely it's going to be much worse, even if we did sort of improve in January or Feb, right? Because there would have been a full 6 months of effect, and then they would slowly be coming out of it. No one's going to jump straight back up to where they were pre-COVID.
No, that's absolutely right, Pat. That's what it's going to be. It's going to be a slow start for many. And I think if you look at the September quarter, I think it's going to align more with the last 6 months numbers or last 3 months numbers than the last year's numbers.
Yeah.
So, as I said, not all companies were affected in the same way. There's been some that has done really well out of the whole COVID situation. So Marley Spoons is a company that we can take as an example. As you know, they would deliver foodstuff to your doorstep, and along with that comes a nice little menu where you can use. So this solved two problems for people who were affected by the pandemic. A, they didn't have to go shopping, and perhaps if you're somebody like me, the biggest advantage is that you didn't have to think about what I'd have to cook for dinner. So it solved two problems in one go. But what this resulted is in a massive jump in their Q2 performance or second quarter performance, where the revenue jumped by 129%. And in a time where companies, or a lot of companies, are not actually providing forward-looking statements because there's relief on that, they were bold enough to say that the next year's numbers would be 80 to 100% high as well, high from the current numbers. So very confident on the outlook, and that's based on the trends that they have seen. Next slide. Now, Afterpay has been fairly well talked about, but again, they were a clear winner. And I think there's some interesting dynamics over here, is that, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, where Anis had said that their credit card portfolio has come down. I think people have become more conservative with the spending, and they don't want to rack up credit card bills. Here's where companies like Afterpay came in really nicely. There was a lot of skepticism as to how the buy now, pay later market would go when COVID came in, but proved to be otherwise, where people felt that it's better to buy something, not pay interest on it, and pay off with only about 4 installments and avoid paying any interest on that. So their performance, as you can see over here, went up by 112%, and that's a phenomenal growth, and that has been across the buy now, pay later industry. Next slide, please. Now, I think when we look at the revenue, there's a few different things that needs to be looked at a bit carefully. And one of the things is the geographical importance of where a company operates. Now, Ramsay Health is a company that, as you may know, operate hospitals, and they operate in a few different countries. So if you look at the numbers over here, to your left is how they performed in Australia. The middle one is the UK, and the one to your right is Europe. Now, in Australia and UK, they were affected, and their revenues came down because selective surgeries were taken off, and they failed. They had a number of restrictions that they had to live by. Whereas in Europe, the governments, especially France and Sweden, got together with Ramsay Health, and they started caring or using their facilities more for the COVID-19 patient treatments. What this resulted is that they were able to boost the revenue in Europe, but in Australia and UK it came down. So where a company operates, doing the same thing, I suppose, in different markets or different geographical locations could mean different outcomes at times. So maybe we look at something a bit more familiar and more at home. So next slide, please. So this one over here is about Crown, and as you can see, their revenue has dropped on an overall basis by about $600 million over there. But if you can look at the numbers, you would see that Melbourne has the steepest reduction, followed by Perth and the UK. But whereas the online gambling numbers have obviously gone up. Now, next quarter results are going to be a bit different for Crown because Melbourne has been on a lockdown, and they're not going to come out of it by the sounds of it until at least end of September, October maybe. So their results are going to be subdued, and whereas the other regions, they would do reasonably well still. Next slide, please. So let's look at the trends that emerged over here. I think the first thing that we got to consider when looking at revenue is that fluctuations could have been much steeper. If these conditions continue to the next year, it will be deceived to think that the current trend or current reductions in revenue is going to continue to the next year. They could be much steeper. Taking examples like Ramsay and Crown, the trends are clear that where a company operates matters. The geographical area where you operate in matters quite substantially. And there are winners and losers. Not all industries were affected the same. Some did better, and in fact, made it an opportunity to grow and venture into markets that they would have taken years to get into if not for COVID. Next slide.
Shavantha, do you have a sense of what other businesses or industries will report, financial increases over the next 12 months?
Good question, Pat. And look, I think it's the answer is, I think there's no straight answer, to be honest. It all depends on how the COVID-19 situation evolves. Now, if it goes off tomorrow, I think there will be there'll be a trend where people want to get out a bit more, buy less online, and more go and do their shopping in the malls, and more going into shops and so on and so forth. But if the trend continues, the COVID-19 trend continues, which seems to be the most likely situation, I think industries such as buy now, pay later is going to grow. Entertainment in terms of books and the Netflix and stuff like that's going to grow. And if you want safe bets, I think it's about sticking with companies that are providing essential items like your food, your groceries, and the likes. So the answer would be largely dependent on how the pandemic is going to play out.
Yeah, and it seems like e-commerce is a big one, and it's almost here to stay. People have been able to get used to trusting online shopping, regardless of whether it's for food and beverage, but also for gifts and homewares and whatnot.
That's absolutely correct. And if you look at the buy now, pay later industry, it sort of started off, providing for clothing and equipment and electronic goods and stuff like that. Just the other day, I got an email saying you can buy a pizza from Pizza Hut now through Zipco. So there you go.
That's $5 in 4 installments. It's not a lot of money.
Absolutely. All right, so let's talk about the second concept here, and that's going to be profitability. Now, again, let's start with the familiar. Qantas is a really good example to talk about the familiar things. Obviously they were devastated with grounding of all the flights and what happened in the travel industry. So, a company that made a little over $800 million in profit, suddenly turned out to be making a loss of $1.9 billion. And that's all because of what they had to go through. So clearly, a lot of companies from a profitability perspective got quite adversely affected by the COVID-19 issue. So let's get into some more details on this area. Next slide, please. Now, the thing to note again is that similar to revenue, there were certain companies that clearly benefited out of the COVID situation. So I think Coghlan is a case in point, which is a pure online retailer of white goods and electronics and so on and so forth. And their profits, as you can see over here, on a half-yearly basis in comparison between 2019 and 2020, grew by a staggering 82%. So that's because people decided that's better to order stuff online and get them delivered to you rather than going and doing the shopping at the shops. Next slide, please. But the important things perhaps to note that even within the same industry, sometimes there can be substantial differences. So let's take the mining industry and two different subsectors in the mining industry. So Fortescue, who's involved in iron ore, saw their profits go up 49% or by $4.7 billion, a massive amount, as you can see. At the same time, Whitehaven Coal saw their revenue reduced by 94%. So it's important to understand what the story is. For iron ore, the demand continued. China kept on buying, and as a result, the prices went up, and Fortescue was able to make quite a substantial profit over there. Whereas the story for Whitehaven is that coal was predominantly provided by Whitehaven to emerging markets. So countries like Indonesia and India was quite substantially affected by COVID-19. And as a result, the prices reduced and the demand dampened. And as you can see over there, they made their profits were down by 94%. Next slide, please. But there were some really good stories here as well. And I think JB Hi-Fi is a case in point. Now, while retail was suffering so much, I think JB Hi-Fi was able to adapt quite well. And they did have a bit of an early start in terms of getting into the online sales. But what they did was really ramp that up with COVID-19. Now, what this meant was that they were able to increase their profitability as much as 25%. Now, this is a substantial increase for a brick and mortar company or traditionally a brick and mortar company. And what happened was, since they went online or did more sales online, the cost base that they had reduced, because obviously they didn't have to have as many staff or didn't want to, or had no need to have a lot of shops or pay rents and so on and so forth. So they did really well out of this situation by adapting to the COVID-19 challenges. And
I think through all of this, there's a lot of doom and gloom and a lot of negativity, and Creditor Watch has been in the media, myself in the media quite a bit, and I'm constantly trying to find positives because I don't like talking about negative aspects and topics all the time, though it's difficult at the moment. But the one thing that has come out of it, now JB Hi-Fi is obviously an enormous listed entity, but You compare them to a Myer or a David Jones, and even you just look at other businesses that have been affected, hospitality, winemakers, etc. You find that a lot of businesses are finding their entrepreneurial spirit within them, and they're realizing that they have to start producing either new goods or adapting their goods or moving their timelines forward to embrace online technology and the cloud and whatnot. So I think, what we are seeing is a positive out of it is that people are embracing the difficulties and the change. And while some are sort of have their feet stuck in the mud and maybe in denial and are getting left behind, there's plenty that are looking forward and realizing it's kind of do or die at the moment. And that's for me is one of the positives to come out of this, is to see people adapt and take advantage of technology, especially that's out there. So yeah, I like that. I like that example. Thank you.
No, that's quite correct, Pat. And there's some really good stories coming out, and I think the adaptation has been quite interesting on how people have got along, and there's a lot of companies who made really good progress. Now, when it comes to profitability, obviously we got to look at the expenses, and there were some interesting areas coming in over here. Lots of companies we've seen has been affected by very specific COVID costs. So these are costs that they didn't have before, but came about predominantly because of COVID. Now, if you look at Woolies and look at their sales numbers, it's actually gone up. So the group sales are up 8.1%, and online sales are up as well by as much as 42%. But what happened was their net profits after tax dropped by 1.2%. And that's because people were at the beginning of the pandemic, and whenever there was spikes, there was a lot of pantry loading. What this meant was that Woolies as a company had to scramble and forget about the economies of scales that they have built in terms of their supply chain management, and stock their outlets at an enormous cost so that people have access to the goods that they wanted. So that put a bit of a span on the works and costed a lot of money. The other reason Woolworths, I mentioned in their financials, is that they had to spend a lot of money trying to make the stores safe for their staff and the customers. So these expenses resulted in Woolies making less profit, notwithstanding the increase in profitability or increase in revenue that they actually had. So let's look at another example. Next slide, please.
I like the pantry loading as opposed to panic buying, because I'm pretty sure that the panic buying, which I like to call it, that actually assisted in a huge way the GDP for that second quarter of the calendar year, didn't it? Because people were buying sort of Woolworths and Coles and whatnot were experiencing a full quarter worth of buying in 1 month. And it's probably the reason we didn't go into a recession sooner. So, but yeah, pantry loading, I like it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You're right, Pat. There was a lot of that. Yeah, the amount of stuff that people bought, and I must confess, I was one of those guys. Being in risk means that you try to minimize your risk, I suppose, and that did help the GDP growth, as you say, in those quarters. So the other area that we want to look at in financials is obviously from a cost-based perspective, the impairments or bad debt cost. Now, again, if you look at Center Group, as you can see over here, they have provided over 200 million in the last 6 months compared to the previous for impairments. Now, this is a substantial expense. Now, as you can see over here from this set of financials, that is as much as or a bit higher than 20% of the revenue. So essentially, this company expects to collect or lose at least 20% of their revenue because of non-payment by tenants. Now, what I would say here is, while some would be very upfront about the losses that they would make and make, very prudent provisions, others might be, but perhaps, as you said, in a bit of a denial, and you might not see numbers in terms of impairments or bad debt provisions. When analyzing financials, if those numbers are not there, it has to be questioned as to why they feel that all their debts can be collected, because we know quite well that's not going to be the case.
Yeah.
Next slide, please. Now, the other problem that loads of companies had was the inflexibility with their cost structure. So as you can see from over here, I've taken Blackmore as an example, and what that says over here is that their revenue came down quite substantially, but they could not quite control the cost base. And as you can see, most of their major cost items continue to either increase or be at the same levels that they are. So that was a substantial issue that they had. And some of you may have heard the CEO speaking a few days ago, and he's identified this issue, and he's mentioned that unfortunately around 10% of their 1,400 workforce will be made redundant because they really have to cut cost, because keeping the cost or not being able to reduce cost would mean that they are going to incur losses as they go forward. Next slide, please. So let's again sort of generalize, I suppose, from the trends that we have seen. Similar to revenue, the first observation I would make is that the fluctuations could have been much steeper. So for companies who made small losses, the losses would have been substantial, and reduction in profitability would have been much worse than what we saw in the numbers before. So watch out for that. Again, there are winners and losers. Not all the industries were affected the same way. So that's an important thing to note as well. In looking at the financials, it's quite important to understand the COVID-specific expenses. Most organizations incurred this. We got to make sure that people have provided for these expenses sufficiently. When you have a variable cost base, you are better off, because with fluctuating revenues, you are able to then, reduce your cost and maintain profit levels, or in other words, not incur losses. However, if a company has a very fixed or a sort of a not very flexible cost base, then that becomes difficult and you can end up making losses. And as we saw from examples such as JB Hi-Fi, adaptation has been the key to success, and this will be tested in the coming year as well.
Shavantha, can I put you on the spot a little bit, and you can push back on me if you want, but what sort of impact or role did JobKeeper play, do you think, in the profitability of some of these larger organizations?
Oh, it's quite substantial, Pat, because if you look at companies like Blackmore, and maybe we just go one slide back to emphasize this, if you can. Yeah. So as you can see over there, the labor cost is a substantial amount at $160 million, right? And as I said, there are about 1,400 employees that they were looking at for the reduction, where they said 10% of that will have to go. So labor is going to be quite a substantial component of a lot of organizations, and the Australian economy is quite dependent on services, and the services sector would have the labor cost in the services sector will be much higher as well than in the manufacturing sector. So JobKeeper has essentially helped a lot of these companies still make or still show some profits, notwithstanding the reduction in revenues. And once this is taken off, one would expect that those profitability levels would come down, or the ones who are making marginal profits can actually end up making substantial losses.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting when that one gets pared back from the sort of start of October, and then 2 when it's eventually turned off altogether.
That's correct. All right, so the next area that we want to look at is borrowing. Now, in the borrowing area, our observations have been actually a mixed bag. There has been some trends, but it's on an overall basis, you find examples in polar opposite directions from time to time. And now let's look at corporate travel management as an example over here. Obviously their revenues were substantially affected because corporate travel pretty much died off because of the COVID-19 situation. Now what they chose to do, as you can see over here, between 19 to 2020, they just pretty much paid up all of their debt. They were in a fortunate position. Not everybody can do that because they had spare cash, and they did not need that money for their operations because they didn't see operations ramping up anytime soon. They decided to pay up their loans. So at face value, this looks really good, but sometimes the devil's in the detail. So if you look at the notes that's below, and I've sort of highlighted that area for you. There was 2 observations over here. One is that they've found themselves in a covenant breach. Now, a covenant is or covenants are what banks or financial institutions place on companies, saying if you borrow money from us, you got to make certain conditions. You got to make certain profitabilities conditions. You can't borrow more than a certain amount. You got to have certain amount of cash within your balance sheet. So these covenants are placed so that the lenders protect themselves against companies going under or doing things in a way that will danger the money the lenders have borrowed to these companies. So what's happened over here is, as you can see, because of the problems that corporate travel management faced, that they were in breach of banking covenants. But also the another important thing to note over here is that they have been able to quite successfully renegotiate those terms. And this is a theme that we see. A lot of organizations previously, if they are in breach of banking covenants, banks would take quite a serious stance on it because they can treat it on a case-by-case basis. Unfortunately, with COVID, lots of companies are in breach of the banking covenants. So there is an element of leniency shown over here, where the banks have come to the party, I suppose, and said, yep, we understand you guys are in a difficult situation. Let's just forget about the covenants for now, or let's just renegotiate those. The second point that I would like to note over here, as you can see, that their borrowing limits have reduced. So previously it was 125,000, and these are British pound denominated loans that they have taken. So this has dropped from 125 million to 100 million. So there's a reduction in the limits over here. I'll explain this a bit more in the next slide, but let's just make those 2 observations for now: breach of covenants and the reduction of limits. Next slide, please. So SEEK, as you know, is a substantial company that makes a substantial amount of revenue. Over here, what you can see is, unlike the previous example, the borrowing levels have gone up. So it's divided into 2, current and non-current. Both current borrowing and non-current borrowing has gone up, as you can see over here. So SEEK took opposite direction to corporate travel management, and they actually ended up borrowing more, notwithstanding the operations coming down. And for a lot of organizations, this was needed because borrowing was the only way that they saw in order to bring money in to run the day-to-day operations. If you look at the area that is highlighted below in yellow, that's another important observation. In 2019, SEEK had unused limits or access to limits of $603 million. Now this has almost halved in 2020, and it has come down to $332 $322.5 million. And this is a common theme as well, where either through excessive utilization or because of banks squeezing the limits, the overall money available for organizations have come down. Now you might think 322 million, well, that's an awful lot of money still available in terms of unused facilities. So let me take you to the next slide there. Now you got to put that 322 million into perspective and look it from the perspective of, I suppose, the overall expenses. Now SEEK is a company that turns around about $1.5 billion. And again, as you can see from the highlighted area, their expenses is about $1.41 billion. So when you have expenses of that nature, you can run through 328 million quite quickly. So it's important for organizations to have access to really good or meaningful limits. But if the banks keep on squeezing the limits, or if they lose the limits that they have in terms of being able to borrow, they would find themselves in difficulty. Next slide, please. Again, perhaps the best place to look at how the Australian companies are going in terms of the borrowing is to look at the financial statements of the banks themselves. What are these financial statements indicating to us? So I've taken two areas from ANZ and Commonwealth Bank recent financial statements. As you can see from the left, that's the statement and the analysis that was presented in ANZ Bank's financial statements. And as the underline or highlighted area would say, ANZ had about 22,000 business loans or commercial loans with around $9.5 billion, which was in deferral. So that's a substantial amount of money. Now let's look at what Commonwealth Bank had to say in their statements. They provided 1.5 billion additional provisions because they expected their loan portfolio, some people not being able to pay. So they provided as much as 1.5 billion additional for possible losses. And as a result, Commonwealth Bank made 11% less revenue. So it's important to note that from the bank's perspective, they are expecting some huge losses to come through. Next slide, please. So what are the trends from a borrowing perspective? As I said, it was a bit of a mixed bag. Some paid up while others borrowed further. Covenant breaches was quite common, but what is also common was being able to renegotiate these covenants and get the banks to come into the party. It was a concern that a lot had their limits reduced. So a lot of companies had their banking limits squeezed or reduced. And if you look at the bank's balance sheets and P&Ls itself, it indicates that they are expecting some sharp non-payments. Unfortunately, the thing about non-payments, Pat, as you would agree, is that once you default on your bank loans, there really is very limited opportunity for you to go back, and the chances are that you would end up defaulting the other creditors as well.
That's right. The bank is generally the last person that you default on. You pay them up until the last minute, and once you stop paying them, that's the end of the line.
That's right. Next slide, please. Now, perhaps the most important thing for companies is to understand whether their own customers would pay them up, or whether their own suppliers are in a position to continue to supply to them. These are the things that's keeping a lot of business owners awake at night in today's context. So,
and Shavantha, I might just interrupt you just really quickly, sorry. But I think what's important to note from this is that while large organizations are being used as examples here, your Westfields and your SEEKs and corporate travel management and whatnot. It doesn't only, we're not only talking about large organizations, public companies. It's much easier to sort of show their results because they're public results. However, you know, even if you're trading with smaller organizations, medium-sized organizations, large ones that may not necessarily publicly display their financials, if they are a key trading partner, be it on the, you know, the supply side or the customer debtor side, taking into consideration their financials where possible, and that is, you know, asking for their financials and utilizing Creditor Watch or CreditSource to assess those is as important as looking at, you know, these larger ones and the larger ones who trade with the larger ones. So I don't want anyone to be put off. Ultimately, what I'm saying here, I don't want anyone to be put off by the big names that are up on screen here. There is no reason why, if you are very reliant on a key trading partner, you should be able to ask them for their financials, and then we can obviously assist in assessing them using Shavantha and CreditSource's vast experience.
That's absolutely right, Pat. And the examples that we are using is because they're easy, they're well-known names, but they are being used obviously to show common trends that we see across organizations and industries. Yeah. So coming back to liquidity, as you can see over here, you know, Westfield, their revenue reduced by 16%, but revenue's got nothing to do with liquidity. But I just want to show you something over here. So 16% was the revenue reduction. Hold that thought for a moment. Next slide, please. However, if you look at the cash flow situation, you can see that the cash generated from operations have reduced as much as 35%. Now that's phenomenal, because that indicates a quite substantial issue where from a 6 months basis, the amount of cash that they were able to collect from their customers is reduced quite substantially. And they also produced a very interesting insight in their financials. So next slide, please, Pat. If you look at this slide over here, it gives a really good representation on what's happening and perhaps a bit of a silver lining as well. If you look at the first quarter, that's Jan, Feb, March, you can see that they were able to collect about 90% of their rentals. Now this dropped substantially in the second quarter, and it dropped to 48% collectively between April, May, and August. But perhaps the silver lining that we see over here is that it's on a somewhat upward trajectory. So May's been better than April, June's been better than May. But the million-dollar question, I suppose, is how is this going to trend into the future? If we are able to successfully curtail the pandemic, things would get better. But the quarter one and quarter two is a real good example on how things can get bad and how quickly it can happen if, you know, we have another wave of this pandemic coming in.
I think also, just touching on a point that you made earlier, is looking at the geographic location. It would be really interesting to then compare, you know, Q2 and ultimately Q3, which will be more insightful, comparing the various states. Because obviously Victoria is going to be a lot worse off than New South Wales. And what we're starting to see is the likes of Queensland and WA actually pull away from New South Wales in terms of health.
That's correct. That's correct. Next slide, please. So the other phenomenon that we have seen across the companies that we analyze is tightening of the liquidity position, and a common sort of ratio that we can use over here is the current ratio. Now Ravsem is a semiconductor manufacturer, not a very big organization, but in this sizable sales to overseas markets, they were quite substantially affected because of the shipping issues that came about. And as you can see over here, is that their current assets reduced by 23%. If you look at the current asset composition, you would see that the cash position reduced and the inventory is reduced as well. On the other hand, what's happened is that the current liabilities have gone up quite substantially, and that is as a result of taking short-term loans in order to fund the operations. So on an overall basis, the current ratio or the liquidity that current ratio represents have come down. Next slide, please. Now, events and hospitality management, as you know, they run a couple of well-known hotels and cinemas. Now let's look at the current liability section over here. And now what you can see here is that loans and borrowings, suddenly there is a 488 million borrowing that has happened in here. And in 2019, there was no such borrowings. And this has resulted in the current ratio to drop to very dangerous levels of 0.55 times compared to 1.24 times in the previous year. Now, I want to draw your attention here because this is a real tell sign a lot of organizations have to look at. So maybe we go to the next slide, please. Now, here's what has happened with this company. As you can see, the loans that was previously non-current, so that means they don't have to be immediately paid up. They can be paid over after about a year, or between say 1 year or 5 years or whatever. Those loans suddenly became current, meaning they had to be paid immediately. Now this typically indicates covenant breach. So if you breach your covenants, what the bank says, now these loans are due. So as a result, the auditors would categorize them as current loans, which means they appear as if they have to be paid immediately. So if you're looking at the numbers and if you see large fluctuations, this is something that needs to be taken into consideration, because this could very well spell that going forward, a company can have substantial issues. Now, in fairness to Events Hospitality Management, post the balance sheet, they were able to discuss with their banks and get the covenants removed and their facilities renegotiated. So they're doing all right from that perspective. But on a standalone basis, at this point in time, this is quite a substantial issue. Next slide, please. So in terms of the common trends, on a liquidity perspective, we saw that the overall cash holdings reduced in a lot of organizations. The liquidity position on an overall basis deteriorated, and the cash that was generated from operations reduced. And these obviously have quite substantial repercussions, and I think in the short to mid-term, perhaps liquidity is the main problem that the organizations are going to face. And if they are able to get on top of the liquidity portion, still generate adequate cash or have access to adequate cash through bank loans and bank borrowings or their shareholders, I think they have a better chance of survival than somebody who is just running out of cash and does not have any option of borrowing any money anyway. So final slide, please. So in terms of the conclusions, on an overall basis, based on the financials that we have analyzed and looked at, and based on the examples that I've used in this presentation, as you can see that, everybody was affected from a revenue perspective, but there were some clear winners. And I think it's important to note that notwithstanding what you see out there in terms of economic numbers, that some would do better than others. The same was true from a profitability perspective. Some made better profits than others. But on an overall basis, for a lot of organizations, there was a massive reduction in profits. The second thing there, which is also quite important to note, is that a lot of organizations had COVID-specific expenses, and I would draw your attention over there in terms of those expenses, specifically to the impairments or bad debt losses. Those were substantial for a lot of organizations, and if you don't see that in a set of financials, you could actually question as to why that is as well. From a borrowing perspective, it was a mixed bag. Some borrowed less, some borrowed more. What is important is that your customers and suppliers have adequate access to bank borrowing. If it's all but dried off, the chances are that they'll find themselves in difficulty in the future. As I said previously, liquidity is possibly going to be the most important thing to watch in the short to medium term, and companies who are liquid and have access to good cash reserves would do better than others. And on an overall basis, I think adaptation seems to be the key. The companies that adapted better and instead of moaning about the situation, just kept improving and finding better ways of doing things, certainly did better in terms of their financial performance, and would also continue to do really well in time to come and manage the financials in the difficult times ahead. Thanks, Brad, and over to you.
Thank you for that, Shavantha. That was fantastic. As always, really good to get some. Look, there's some tips and tips and tricks almost in there for people who have the confidence to look through financials if you can get their hands on them. And of course, you've got Shavantha waiting there to provide his expertise as well. It will be really interesting to see what happens, over the next, or the remainder of this financial year, I should say. Obviously, safe harbour provisions have been extended until the end of December, meaning we can expect to see record low levels for administrations, but ultimately that snowball continues to get bigger, and that will increase and ultimately be let loose once the deadline comes and goes, regardless of whether it is extended again. So please be on the lookout for businesses out there who are ultimately zombie businesses. Plenty being discussed around them. JobKeeper, JobSeeker next month in October will be pared down. JobKeeper especially, there'll be the two-step levels of JobKeeper for full-time and part-time. That would be really interesting. So for companies who are relying on JobKeeper, if they've got a lot of part-time employees, that amount that they were being paid on a fortnightly basis is going to halve. So it's going to put a lot of pressure on their costs and especially their liquidity and cash flow, as Shavantha's just spoken about. Of course, the other things coming to an end are the all-out deferrals by the banks. They are still offering them, but they are going to be more means tested from October onwards. And there are question marks around the deferrals or assistance with commercial rent as well from October. So there will be more pressure. Companies will be looked at more closely by their banks and creditors as to whether they should be getting deferrals and or discounts on things like their rent. So that will put more pressure on organisations out there. And I think, we've done pretty well through this, but I think that the tough times are yet to come. And of course, everyone hoping that Victoria are able to come out of their lockdown as soon as possible. We certainly feel for everyone down in Victoria at the moment, and sending you plenty of positivity and strength. So a really quick poll question here. Obviously, this helps us from a sales or account management perspective to know, do you want to know a little bit more about financial risk assessments? Don't be afraid to say no. This is really for those that want to say yes and do want to be contacted. It allows us to be a little bit more strategic about getting in contact with people who do want more information about financial risk assessments, even if it's a really basic question that can be answered by our staff internally. And if it's a little bit more complex, or you're after a specific report that you might currently be getting or currently producing in-house, you want to see if Shavantha and his CreditSource team can do it for you. They are certainly flexible and innovative like CreditorWatch are, which is why we partner with them. So by all means, please do let us know. All right, most of you have voted there, so thank you. I will close this. And that ultimately takes us to the end of our webinar. It was a long one today, so I appreciate everyone hanging around with us, but it's not the sort of topic that we wanted to race through. We will be sending out the presentation and the recording as well. I just wanted to say on behalf of CreditSource, Shavantha, thanks again for taking the time. I know plenty of time and effort goes into producing the slides and thinking about the content, so thank you for that. It's great to have you on board again, and no doubt we will have another session in the future. I'm sure there were a few questions, but given the time, it looks like some people are starting to leave. What we will do is we will go through those questions and get back to you one-on-one, either someone from CreditWatch or Shavantha if it's a little bit more of a technical question. We will get back to you. I don't want you to feel that we're ignoring you, but thank you for those questions. Thank you again to everyone for joining. I hope you got something out of it. Feel free to contact us if you do require anything, support@creditwatch.com.au, 1300 50 13 12, or just give us a call or contact your account manager. We're really out there and ready to assist in any way we can. I hope everyone is staying safe. I hope everyone's staying healthy and sanitized, and we will certainly see you soon. Thanks again.